Baruchim Abayim, Shalom Aleichem, welcome everyone. We're about to begin our fourth lecture in our lecture series on magic in Judaism. I can say this as an Orthodox rabbi, I can kind of, criticize my own community. Particularly in the Orthodox community, there's this belief that we kind of live in a vacuum and that we have a pure form of Judaism that's not influenced by any outside influences. But obviously, we all know that throughout history, this has never been true. Right from the beginning of the Jewish people, all the way back to Abraham, we lived among other communities, other religions, other cultures. And our interactions with them have had a symbiotic relationship, and there's always been an exchange of cultural ideas all throughout our history, and an influence in our cultures, whether the influence that our culture had on others or influence that other cultures had on us. Now, certain people who are extremists and fundamentalists, particularly from Christian communities, would take that to mean that, well, this is, the Jewish community is tainted by, ancient Babylonian mystery religions and things like that, and it's not the authentic Judaism that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. But that's not true. Much in the way, as I understand it, that in America, I remember Dr. Larry Arnn said that America is the oldest country and the youngest country. Obviously, it's a young country, maybe not the youngest, but it's among the, as we know it, the United States of America. It's only a little over 200 years old, 240 some odd years old. And yet, it's the oldest country because all of these old countries, whether it be England or France or Italy, Germany, Egypt, China, India, they've all undergone changes, fundamental changes. France is a good example that this is already, I believe, the sixth French Republic, and even in between some of the republics, they had an empire, I think maybe even a brief return to monarchy in France, and that the current French Republic is less than 70 years old. So to India, around 70 years old, China, around the same time. Yet America remained, meaning America was not fundamentally transformed after World War II, as so many other countries were. It wasn't fundamentally transformed neither at the beginning of the Soviet era nor at the fall of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. America has maintained its integrity as the United States of America because, and I don't mean to be giving a lecture here in politics, but there's a reason, there's a method to my madness here. It's actually related also in a certain sense to certain things that we'll discuss in this lecture. But America remains America because of the malleability and flexibility of our Constitution that although some people might want to scrap the whole thing and start over again, like many European countries have over the past century, the United States of America remains under this Constitution for all of this time, since the 1780s, precisely because of its ability to change. However, an ability to change that's hard fought, and it's not an anarchist form. It's a form that's very difficult, but it's possible when necessary. In a certain sense, essentially, Judaism has that malleability that it's able to transform over time without losing its essential being of what it is. And so the influences that have shaped Judaism, not merely the Jewish community and various Jewish communities, but Judaism as a religion no one can deny, has transformed over time. And yet it maintains, while criticizing some orthodox beliefs, some popular beliefs that I don't believe to be essential and I don't believe to be true. Like I said, that we haven't changed. Still, with that, it was able to be maintained as the same thing. It's not a new religion. So in a certain sense, it's the same Judaism that was given at Mount Sinai, even though the form of expression has changed over time. There's something essential that binds it all together. Much, although it's not a perfect analogy, but much in the way of how the Constitutional Republic of the United States did not lose its basic identity whenever a new amendment was added to the Constitution, including amendments that abrogated previous provisions in the existing Constitution. And so, too, that's what we have in Judaism. The forces of history have changed Judaism, and the major force of change in Jewish history is exile. But even being an independent commonwealth at earlier times in history, it was clear that the Jewish community was always influenced by their surrounding religions and cultures and communities outside of our own community. And so because of that, you have this dichotomy and this balance. So you have some people a lot of those people not too fond of Jews or Judaism, who will claim that either the Jewish practices are some vestigial Canaanite paganism or some influence of Babylonian mystery religions, and that's where our popular rituals and magic and various religious ideas and mysticism come from. Others will attribute various formations of the Jewish religion to Zoroastrianism under the Persian exile. But the truth is, there's a certain kernel you could call the Pinteleid, right? That Jewish spark that's never lost, both in the individual Jew, but also in the Jewish community. With all of these influences, we never stop being the community that follows the Torah that Moses gave us at Sinai. And it's clear and obvious that, yes, we were influenced by these other communities, by these other cultures, these other religions. The most obvious form of this is the names of our months. If you look earlier in the Torah, and this is something that to me provides basic evidence against the documentary hypothesis and toward the traditional interpretation of the authenticity of the Torah, is that in the Torah, the months are generally only named by ordinal numbers. First month, second month, and so forth. And Nisan is what we call now Nisan is called Chodesh Aviv, the spring month. And beyond that, you don't really have names. And later on, in the books of the prophets, You have other names for the months: Chodesh Ziv, Chodesh Heisonim, Heitanim, and so forth. And then, when we go into exile in Babylon and come back from the exile in Babylon, then we have the names that we use today, which are the Akkadian Babylonian names. And that's all, and they're outright. Tammuz is an idolatrous name. It's the name of an idol. And people, they make up all kinds of stories about the name of the current month. When I'm recording this is Mar Cheshvan, and people say, oh, it's really Cheshvan, but it's called Mar Cheshvan because Mar means bitter, and it's a bitter month because there's no holidays. It's not true. The name of the month is Mar Cheshvan. That's the Babylonian name for the month. It simply means the eighth month. That's what it means, Mar Cheshvan. But we make these interpretations and so forth that are based in nothing, and we have all this folklore that's developed in the Jewish community, often out of pure cloth. But if you're a scholar, and I don't mean just a Talmudic scholar, I mean a secular scholar, that Mar Cheshvan, that's the name. And so we see clearly the Jewish community was influenced by the non-Jewish communities around us, but the opposite is also true. Much like when Columbus discovered America, you had the Columbian Exchange, and so horses that hadn't lived in America for quite some time, had gone extinct, and yet survived in Eurasia, were brought back to America, where they started from, according to the evolutionary theorists. And so many items that only exist in the Americas came back to the old world, whether it be tobacco or potatoes and sweet potatoes and corn and all of these items. And so too, so many of the old world items, like we said, the horses and other animals and other plants, were brought to the Americas. And so you had the Columbian Exchange. So too, of course, not only was the Jewish community influenced by the surrounding non-Jewish cultures during our exile, and even not during our exile, wherever we were in history, we were influenced by our non-Jewish neighbors. So too, the non-Jewish world was influenced by us, by our communities. And often it's difficult to know where one begins and the other one ends. A good example of this would be the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, right? There's a custom to have a vigil on the night of Shavuot, the Feast of Pentecost. To have a vigil, we stay up and we study Torah all night long, right? Or at least most of the night, till late at night. And you go to the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox Christian churches, on their Pentecost, which is usually a week after ours in the Eastern churches, on their Pentecost, they also have a vigil. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? My understanding is that they were influenced by our practice. That's my understanding of it, but that's all. It's fascinating, which one is it? Because there's nothing in the Talmud about staying up late on the night of Shavuot. It's not an obligation; it's a custom. And yet, this non-Jewish community adopted this custom, and that's obviously, when we say something like that, we're missing the forest through the trees. Of course, we're missing the big elephant in the room. Is that Christianity and Islam and to a lesser extent many of the other religions around, are based on Judaism. Or, even if you want to say through the back, through the back door, that the Sikh religion was influenced by Sufi Muslims that, were influenced by Judaism. And so they, even though they're so removed in practice to the point where they would oppose they were opposed Muslim practices and by extension Jewish practices, shechita and things like that, and fasting and making pilgrimages are all officially forbidden in the Sikh religion. But the basic ideas and the monotheism and so forth, it trickled down from Judaism through Sufi Islam into the Sikh world. And this rather modern religion, it's a newer religion, it's only about a little over 500 years old, and far removed from any major Jewish communities. And I don't think there was any Jewish community in Punjab. And yet it developed a new religion and 25 million adherents around the world. And then obviously all the offshoots of Christianity and Islam that have developed, and whether it's the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses or various groups that have broken away from traditional Islam, whatever. Nation of Islam is very far removed from traditional Islam, but still, somewhere down the road, this is influenced from our own faith, and certainly the Nation of Islam, they do respect the Bible, and that's where, that's an obvious thing, is that obviously Christianity has most of their Bible is our Bible, is our Tanakh. What they call the New Testament is smaller than our Pentateuch. It's a very small document compared to our Tanakh. But it's not only in those major ways that this share of influence has spread from from the Jewish world to non-Jewish world, particularly in the world of ritual magic and mysticism. Was there always this exchange between the Jewish and the non-Jewish world? And so you have particularly various magical grimoire that developed in the Middle Ages, became popular in various magical schools that were heavily influenced by Jewish ritual magic, by Kabbalistic sources, and by biblical sources, and the other way around. How the Jewish, particularly the magical practices, were influenced by the non-Jewish practices, to the point of, for example, there are several well-known grimoires that are called under the name the Key of Solomon. And there's the Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon, and it's not clear which came first, the chicken or the egg. Meaning, was this a Jewish work that was translated into Latin, or was it a Latin work translated into Hebrew and Aramaic? Which is it? Most likely, it was the non-Jewish work that some Jewish magicians picked up and translated into Jewish languages, to Hebrew or Aramaic. But when you look at the Key of Solomon, so many of the magical influences and ideas are based in Jewish ideas. They consist of reciting psalms, practicing piety, being a good person, being temperate, and so forth. Things that are not necessarily associated or affiliated with what you would think of the black magic and things like that. No, just the opposite. certainly in the Key of Solomon and other grimoires that were accepted often among Christian clergy. I remember, just a side note, working in a Hasidic bungalow colony, how many stories would be told about a galach, which is a kishufmacher, that a priest, a Catholic priest, or an Orthodox priest, depending on the country, Christian priest, and as a kishufmacher, he's a magician. He practices black magic and does this or that. And I was always kind of offended hearing those stories, as a camp counselor, listening to these are the stories that are told to little kids. But then the truth is, historically, many, many Christian clergy in the Middle Ages used these texts, like the Key of Solomon, to practice ritual magic. And they taught that it's not your own power, it's the power of Almighty God, and using this power by engaging in piety and asceticism and prayer, and that in the merit of this, one is able to take these powers and use them for whatever purposes you want. But then again, some of these grimoires would teach other things, as we discussed in our discussion of the Talmud in magic, the question of different types of magic, whether the magician was performing the magic, the kishuf, on his own, or whether he was invoking demons and taking the aid of demons. And so you have, certainly in the Lesser Key of Solomon, the invocation of demons. And it's interesting how you have 72 demons, similar to how we have in Kabbalistic and in Jewish white magic. You'll have 72 names of God. You'll have the 70 names of the angel Metatron, that's often used in magical practices and other things. And so the balance between these two, it's fascinating, because and these books were often used even by practitioners of black magic. You come later to Alexander Crowley and others, the Thelema movement and so forth, that were more along the lines of black magic, and yet they would use these texts that taught aspects of Jewish ideas. Both by that point they were syncretic, and we're going to get to that in a moment, but they made a syncretic approach, whereas generally the classical Jewish magic, what you call Kabbalah Masis, is the term that's often used today, practical Kabbalah, did not invoke the ideas of Kabbalah that we're familiar with, as the 10 Sefirot and so forth, and even many of the Shemot that are classically used. You would rarely find that in classical amulets, although if you remember, I began our lecture series telling the story about a neighbor of mine, who had an amulet from Rav Aaron of Belz, and he opened up and he showed me, and it had the spheres and it had different shemus, and it was this kameya from Rav Aaron of Belz that he always carried with him, one of my neighbors here. And yet, as history went on in the syncretic world of various movements, you wound up incorporating the Sefirot, the Olamot, different angels, and bringing together a rather ragtag group of syncretic and eclectic magical practices that invoked these terms. And it developed to the point where you had two forms of non-Jewish Kabbalah that called Kabbalah. So you have the Christian Kabbalah that would often prefer to be spelled with the letter C as the first letter, and generally the Jewish Kabbalah would start with a K, and the Christian Kabbalah would be spelled with a C. And that's how it would almost, I guess C could also stand for Christian, but that would often show the difference between Jewish Kabbalah and Christian Kabbalah if the Kabbalah was spelled with the letter C. And there were various forms of Christian Kabbalah, some of which would be Jews who apostatized and tried to use Kabbalah as an evangelizing tool, and a missionizing tool. Some who actually believed took, passages from Christian, what they would call the New Testament, and interpreting them in a Kabbalistic form, which certainly, if you would look at the Gospel of John, there's certainly many Gnostic influences there in John, and to a certain extent, some of the Christian Kabbalists took Matthew and interpreted it in Kabbalistic forms as well. And then you had, as we were discussing before, what's often called the Hermetic Kabbalah, and that would often be spelled with the letter Q instead of the K, which is, in a certain sense, a more of a scholarly approach to use the letter Q in place of the Kuf. Certainly that's related to the Arabic term, like how you see the name Iraq is spelled with a Q, and it's the Arabic Kuf. And so you had these Hermetic Kabbalists who spelled with a Q that influenced these various secret societies, black magic religions, Wiccans, and neo-paganists. And so you had the Society of the Red Dawn, and you had the Thelema movement, as I said, from Crowley, who practiced all kinds of very strange forms of ritual magic and sympathetic magic and so forth, and claimed to really be effective. And then that later influenced Gardnerian Kabbalah, because Gardner himself was a student of Crowley, as well as many others, and all of these that would still invoke Kabbalistic ideas, but interpret them in manners that were not consistent with our own Orthodox teachings. However, the truth of the matter is, quite often, as we said, many of the practitioners of Kabbalah throughout time insisted, would teach things that really would not be considered acceptable in modern Orthodoxy. And I mean with a little m, modern day Orthodoxy. I don't mean young Israel and OU, although they certainly wouldn't consider these things to be acceptable. And yet so many people will have, like I said, the Sefer Raziel HaMalach in the house as an amulet. And the Sefer Raziel HaMalach mentions things there that, if you take it at face value, would seem to go against halacha, offering incense to angels and things like that, that would seem to not be acceptable. And certainly many of the teachers of Kabbalah today, you'll think of someone like Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, who's very strictly Orthodox, and he wrote a book, Faith and Folly, where he discusses, how so many of these practitioners today of Kabbalistic magic and practical Kabbalah are either charlatans or operating things that, by typical Haredi Orthodox standards, would be absolutely forbidden. And yet we see this exchange that constantly has gone on through history, that the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world were influencing one another, and it happened quite often more in magic than anything else. And part of that often would be that the Jewish community was viewed by both Christians and Muslims as being this kind of group of magicians that would not really fit in to the mainstream society, is similar to the view of the Roma people, the Gypsies, and the other various traveler communities, that many of them also practiced forms of ritual magic and still to this day practice forms of ritual magic. And it was seen as a thing that, a lot of movies, you go to the classic Universal horror movies, quite often had some theme about going to a gypsy woman and having a fortune told and so forth. Very rarely would they think of using the Jew as that archetype, but certainly in the Middle Ages, the Jewish community was viewed in that manner. That if, and even earlier in history, in Talmudic times, we have the record of the halacha of searching for chametz. And what if you had an apartment that you shared a wall with a non-Jew, and you shouldn't put your hand into the wall to try to search for chametz? You're not doing anything magical. You're doing something halachic. You're doing something rational, more or less, in line with the Torah's commandment. And yet there was a worry that the non-Jewish neighbor would accuse the Jew of practicing black magic and perhaps seeking to harm the neighbor. And so the rabbis said, if you have a hole in the wall between the Jew and the non-Jew, you could just be mevatel beliba, you could just nullify the chametz, the leavened bread in your heart, lest the non-Jew accuse the Jew of practicing black magic. And so it seems that even in Talmudic times, and this was recorded, this was preserved in the Yotzros, in the Piyutim for Shabbos HaGadol, for Shabbat HaGadol, this halacha that's in the Mishnah. And it seems that it was something that was a worry throughout history, that Jews were worried that the non-Jews would accuse them of black magic. But on that same level, they would seek out the Jew as the practitioner of white magic, of being able to help them in some form of divination or other magical needs. And as I said, there was a symbiotic relationship with that as well. I mean, certainly many of the Hasidic Ashkenaz and other Jews throughout history who practiced ritual magic and faith healing and so forth, and herbology, learned a lot of these things from non-Jewish sources, as well as other things were learned from non-Jewish spiritual sources. You look at many of the Rishonim, many of the medieval Jews had tremendous respect for the Sufi Muslims and would learn meditation practices from them, and study and discuss theology with the Sufi Muslims particularly. Even to the point where it's often been said that in the Sefer Chovos U'Levavos, which was actually written in Arabic, in the Hebrew translation, there's often reference to Hasidim. And many scholars say that when it says Hasidim in the duties of the heart, in the Chovot HaLevavot, it's referring to Chasidei Umot HaOlam, righteous Gentiles, particularly the Sufi Muslim saints. That's not so much in magic as is in meditation and even in theology. Also, the Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, he wrote the Sefer, Sipuk Hashem, Sipuk V'Avodas Hashem, and also he was heavily influenced by the Sufis. But when it came to ritual magic and herbology and so forth, it's often said that the Baal Shem Tov himself, he learned a lot of his healing magic and herbs and so forth from the gypsies around him. And he had that influence there. And in a certain sense, many of the practices that you'll see in neo-paganism, in Wicca, and in ritual magic have definite parallels in the Jewish world. You know, if you look at a Wiccan altar, you're going to have a chalice with wine, you're going to have a knife, and although there's the sexual representation there of male and female between the knife and the chalice, on a Jewish Shabbos table, you're going to have a Kiddush cup and you're going to have a knife to cut the challah. And we don't generally think of these things as magical tools. But then when you talk to the Hasidim, you're going to see how it's not the same as the Wiccans approach it, but there's a certain level of magic that's involved in the Kiddush and in the knife particularly. I mean, I know many Hasidim are very careful not to use a serrated knife to cut the challah, and there's significance in that. But beyond the basic significance of that, I remember one friend of mine, the Nadvarna Rebbe, who practices a lot of ritual magic, particularly goralot, lotteries, casting lots as a divination method. And this is something he pretty much does for a living, is he casts lots for divination. And he told me that it's very important to sharpen the knife Erev Shabbat, Friday before Shabbat, because the knife, by sharpening the knife, you're bringing a segula for Parnasa because that's the knife that you're cutting the challah for Shabbos, and it should be easy. And so to sharpen the knife before Shabbos, there's certain magic in that, and by cutting the bread with a non-serrated knife also has this influence of bringing financial prosperity and blessing into the home. Even probably the famous thing, the Wiccans, they cast the circle. We know they light candles around the circle. We light candles on Shabbat, not around the circle like that. But even casting the circle, I know it's from the Arizal, actually, who we often say opposed ritual magic and opposed practical Kabbalah, but the custom that's brought from the Arizal is to take hadassim, to take myrtle branches, and to make a hakafa, to make a circuit encircling the Shabbat table before making Kiddush, and that's something I started doing recently, and it's comes along the lines very similarly of the Wiccan practice of casting a circle and creating this ritual space. And in a certain sense, even when the Hasidim, they wear a gartel, that's almost casting a circle around oneself. And the truth is, the Wiccans also will wear like a gartel. They'll wear a rope belt around their ritual robes and attach magic to that. And generally, the gartel is not attributed to any magical practice, but it can be interpreted and approached in that way. And so you have these basic similarities that might not be exactly the same, but have a lot in common. And then the major thing that so much of ritual magic is about is conjuring and binding and communicating with various beings, spiritual beings. And of course, the most popular in the Judeo-Christian world, or in the Abrahamic world, would be angels and demons. And the Muslims speak of the jinn, which often, been in the Western world called genies. But the truth is that the way that the traditional Islamic and pre-Islamic Arab teachings speak of the jinn are much more similar to the classical Jewish approaches to Shadim than the Christian form of demons. But you have all these names of various angels and demons that are recorded in so many volumes of all different types of literature from all different sources that are, in general, most of these names are coming from the Jewish sources to begin with. But even many of those predate in a certain sense or can be found independently. And so when we find these similarities, and like I mentioned before, there's this Sefer HaCheshech uh, from the Baal HaRokeach that has the names of the angels Metatron that are used in magical practices in Jewish ritual magic that have influenced also the non-Jewish sources that you can find books of non-Jewish books of magic that will also invoke the names of the angel Metatron. And so these are the types of things that one should be aware of for sure and investigate in a scholarly manner if one is really interested in these things as to the differences and the similarities between the Jewish magic, the non-Jewish magic, how much we've shared, how much we're similar, how much we're different, and also how many of these things really seem to work, whether they work in a psychological manner, whether they work in an actual physical manner, that they're actually conjuring demons and angels or other things and approaching this. We know in the Key of Solomon, there's instruction on how to attach to a guardian angel who can tell you things, which is very similar to other things that are well known in the Jewish world. Probably one of the most famous stories about Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, how he was able to communicate with what is called a Magid, which is generally understood as an angel that can tell him things, but others will interpret the Magid to actually be a manifestation of one's own higher self. But there's a sefer called Magid Mesharim, which is a record, a channeled literature, really, of the Magid, of what the Magid told Rav Yosef Karo, and how similarly other religions and practitioners of magic sought out those types of influences, and also even earlier in Jewish history. I mean, you have a sefer called Shalos V'Tshuvas Min Hashamayim, responsive from heaven, which shouldn't make any sense because we understand Torah lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven. The way the rabbis understood that is that you do not receive halachic guidance from any post-Mosaic revelation, because whatever God gave Moses is good enough, and we can interpret it from there. God gave us the tools to interpret, and that's in halacha, that's all we're supposed to do. And yet, there's a sefer, it's essentially channeled literature, Shalos V'Tshuvas Min Hashamayim, and it's accepted in the Jewish world. And the reason for that is, again, because the concept of Das Torah is that a person can go into a trance state and be influenced, and if someone is filled with Torah, what's going to come out is going to be Torah. And if someone is filled with other traditions, and other is going to come out from those traditions. You're not generally going to have something radically different from a person in any culture, in any tradition, going away from their own in any of this channeled literature. People bring out of there what they're looking for, but when you have someone who's indeed a pious scholar, their innermost being is going to come out, which is piety and scholarship. And so that's the value of these types of things. And ultimately, like we've said before, many of the students of magic, and I think particularly of Rabbi Ariel Bar Tzadok, who's written extensively on this subject, and I recommend his books on the subject, as well as his website, koshertorah.com. He often says that any real magician will tell you there's no such thing as magic, and really it's all psychology, but the power of psychology is extremely powerful. The power of the mind is extremely powerful. And if you study Carl Jung, as Rabbi Bar Tzadok did for a long time, you're going to find that the power of psychology, it's not games. It's the real deal. And it can appear to us to be magical, which is the same thing that the Chassam Sofer certainly taught that what appears to be supernatural is really natural, and eventually science will catch up to that which we got at Mount Sinai. But the truth is, I've seen the Buddhists say the same thing, that anything that appears to be supernatural and miraculous and being done by their saints it's really only a form of technology, just that the science hasn't gotten there yet. But the old traditions always had it. And that's what this really comes down to, in a certain way, that Sefer is called the Key of Solomon, the Miftach Shlomo is how it's often referred to in Hebrew, or Maftech Shlomo. If we go to what tradition tells us that King Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, in Sefer Kohelet, is Sof Davar Kol Nishma at Elokim Yirev, it's Mitzvotav Shemor Kizeh Kol Adam. The main thing, when after everything's been said and done, and then the last word is, after you heard everything, fear God and keep His mitzvot, because that's the entirety of the human experience of all human beings, is just to be aware of God and to keep His commandments. That's what God wants, and that's more important than all these other things. And we can manifest things through that, but ultimately, if you're really God-fearing and if you're really going to follow Tamim Tiyeh Hashem Lokecha, and that's what, like we said, there's the Sefer Faith and Folly in Hebrew, it's called Tamim Tiyeh. If we're really straightforward and just following God, we don't need all that stuff. But if it's going to improve our lives and bring us closer to God, and the fact is, even we have our mitzvot that we do, and you want to ritualize this so it invokes a certain emotional feeling and psychological experience while we do these mitzvot, and this gives us the veikut and yirat shemayim and brings us closer to God, and recognizes that everything's ultimately the power of God, and we are not accomplishing anything like many of these ritual magicians recognized. There's nothing wrong with that, and the fact of the matter is it could be a very good thing in our lives, and we don't have to be seeking to get things done, like so many of the magicians and the alchemists tried to learn to make themselves invisible and love potions and all these types of things to get something out of it. I don't think that's personally, I'm editorializing here a little bit. I don't think that's so appropriate. But what is appropriate, I believe, is if it's something that influences you to get into a spirit of piety and worship, and get you ready to worship God. And these things are tools to help you to actually worship God, and not just be going through the rote by rote, and just doing a ceremony with no feeling and no emotion and no psychic energy, And if there's other aspects of ritual that are within the realm of halacha, that are permitted, that are allowed, like we said, there's halachically speaking, you can certainly use a serrated knife to cut challah, or you could just break the challah with your hands. You don't need to cut the challah at all. But if you studied these ideas and that influences you, and we're going to talk in the next segment about food-based magic and prayer-based magic and other things like that, and rituals that are involved in that, if that inspires you and reminds you that God is in control, and it helps you grow in your worship of God and in your piety, I don't see any problem with that necessarily. And I personally enjoy these types of things as well. But none of them are necessary, and if they don't work for you, don't go running after it and don't think that it's so important. But if it works for you, it's very good. And to each his own. It's not really for everybody. It's not meant to be for everybody. Before I conclude, I'll just follow up a little bit more about this angelology and demonology. In the neo-pagan traditions, there's a lot of discussion not only of angels and demons, but of human ghost spirits, those that have passed on, and also other spiritual beings, whether they be fairies or imps or elves and earth spirits and so forth. And the truth is, there are Jewish records of these types of beings as well. And I'll just hearken, and even my holy Zayda, the Chavos Yair, who I certainly have a tremendous devotion to, both as an ancestor and as a great saint, and a scholar and a source of inspiration. He's recorded as being aware of non-Jewish books that discuss the existence of elves and other things. But I mentioned Rabbi Bar Tzadok. He said something very interesting along these lines. He said, sure, you could go and talk to an earth spirit that's attached to a tree or to a brook or to a particular rock, but what's the point of that? Meaning, if you're talking to an angel, talking to Elijah the prophet, you're talking to a spirit of a saint, of a tzaddik that went on, and you get something from that. That's very positive. And I've had those experiences. Even tzaddikim, when they're alive, they can also, according to these traditions, they can have influence and communicate. And I remember when the Sklener Rebbe, Zechron Levracha, he was still alive, and I had a conversation with him in a dream, and he told me certain things, and I took that very seriously, because it's very real. Because if the Sklener Rebbe is telling me something, and I'm not a Sklener Chassid, but I had tremendous devotion to Sklener Rebbe when he was alive. I don't have as much now, although I still love him very much. I went only once to his grave since he's passed on, that I can remember, maybe twice. But if the Sklener Rebbe is telling me something, I better listen. If a rock or a tree or a brook is going to tell me something, why should I listen? What do I care what they have to say? It doesn't mean anything. And there's a certain bit of intelligence in that, and recognizing, yeah, these things are real, but so what? Yeah, and the truth is, if I'm going to talk to a homeless guy outside the kosher pizza shop and he's going to tell me something, also, so what? Except in the sense of how the Baal Shem Tov says, whatever you see and hear, it's all a message from God. But you don't take it in the form of Koyamar Hashem, thus saith the Lord, the way Scripture is. It's all right. This is all well and good, and it's but don't take it too seriously. What the opinions of a tree or a rock, right? And so too with angels and demons, it's important to be careful and know what you're getting into. We only have a few minutes left. I'd like to keep this under an hour. I only planned it to be a half hour, to be honest. But I remember the story Rabbi Bar Tzadok told us from the Sefer Minchat Eliyahu. And this Rabbi Eliyahu Kohen was the chief rabbi of Izmir, Turkey. He's the author of the Shevet Musar, which is a more famous sefer. And the Rabbi Eliyahu, the story goes, was that a man came to him and he said, Rabbi, I'm having visions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Gabriel, and I know and they're only telling me good things, but I know I'm not worthy to these things. How should I approach this? And he said, when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob come to you, ask them, are you Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Avot HaOlam, the patriarchs of the world? Are you the biblical figures, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Or are you just three guys, and you're telling me the truth? Your name is Abraham, your name's Isaac, your name's Jacob. But you're not the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're just demons or whatever you are, or ghosts or whatever you are. And you're telling me the truth. Your name's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you have some information that impresses me because I didn't know that. And you're telling me the future and telling me this and that. But you're really going to use this to manipulate me in the end. And when he asked them that question, they didn't bother him anymore. And then he asked Gabriel, are you the Archangel Gabriel, or are you just a guy named Gabriel? You know, there's Gabe Kaplan, right? I don't mean it's Gabe Kaplan, and this Gabriel got a little upset. He said, this was our secret. Why'd you tell the Chacham? Why'd you tell the rabbi? But the rabbi understood that this was a sign that this was a demon in angel's clothing. And the rabbi gave him an amulet. And then Gabriel didn't bother him anymore either. And the lesson of that story is discernment. Because just because you're told something, don't take it at face value. The way that these, whatever it is, whether angels or demons or people on earth, they'll often confront you in a manner that with their omissions, in what they're revealing to you, it's intended to trick you. And don't be tricked. You have to learn discernment. And the major way to learn discernment is through the study of Gemara, the study of Talmud. It teaches one to be discerning. It teaches one to look at every detail, the hair-splitting Talmudic logic that so many people speak of. It trains the mind, in addition to the fact that it's a mitzvah to learn Torah. And that's the main thing, is that it's a mitzvah to learn Torah, but there's certainly a side benefit there of Torah study, of sharpening the mind, of learning logic, being able to learn how to learn, and how to interact with things in the world, including magical things like angels and demons and so forth, by learning how to interpret things properly and not making assumptions when things are omitted from what's being taught. So I bless you all that you should all go in the ways of Torah, follow the proper path, and not be misled by any demonic forces or anything, and try to stay on the proper path, but also be aware and be intellectually honest, recognizing that not everything is so pure, sourced or anything. There's a lot of this world, and this all was created by God. So there's good and bad all mixed together that you have to learn how to deal with. So thank you for watching, and if you have any questions or anything, you know how to contact me. All right. God bless.